Now, the final years of the First World War brought about a lot of changes for women, and the post-war era also introduced different opportunities for these ladies. So let me start off by introducing you to a typical mixed batch who were photographed en route for the Western Front in France. And it is not moving. Why is it not moving? There we are. Sorry about that. I must have to hit it very hard. The Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, who was soon being called WACS for short, were formally created in March 1917. And the first important point I want to make is that batches like this mixed group were drawn from every corner of England, Scotland, and Wales, and from all parts of Ireland to carry out administrative tasks of every kind for the army. And I want to make it very clear that they didn't engage in any form of nursing, ambulance, or hospital work. As I'm sure you know, many hundreds, if not thousands, of young Irish women served as Red Cross and Army nurses, and their story and their bravery has been well recognised and written about, together with the ladies who made up what were known as volunteer detachment units, or VADs for short. So, as you can see in this batch in this photograph, who were setting off for France in 1917, they're all wearing WAC Army uniforms, which were made of gabardine, known as coat dresses. They'd have to wear these uniforms at all times, winter and summer, for the next 2 or 3 years. And when the weather got cold, they would have been issued with heavy regulation army greatcoats that they could wear over the uniforms. When in transit like this, each girl's belongings were packed into a kit bag, one slung over one shoulder, and the rest of her stuff contained in just one small suitcase. Well, I suppose you could say that army life had thus cut down all essentials to a few bare necessities. But the ladies in this shop seemed happy enough bunch all the same. So now, let me just give you a few basic facts to be going on with, and I shall try to go easy on the inevitable statistics. First of all, you should know that by the end of the war, the number of women who had been recruited to serve as WACs was reckoned to have been altogether between 57 and 60,000 young women, who, as I've said, were not nurses or VADs, but instead sought for other much-needed army work. And let's be clear about one thing. To be a member of an army corps meant they had to formally sign up to all the strict army rules and regulations, just like any ordinary soldier. That meant that discipline was always very tight. And if they broke the rules, there were fines and other forms of punishment, such as loss of privileges. And they had to learn to drill and march and salute, just like any soldier. And their coat dress uniforms had to be worn at all times, albeit sometimes covered by an apron or an overall if this was needed for the work they were doing. Their senior officers were also all women, and they were also all in uniform, which consisted of a rather smarter jacket and skirt, which was worn with a shirt and tie. Of course, because the army still had a bit of a problem in coming to terms with the reality of needing female support for the campaign, no enlisted WAC was allowed military title. So instead of generals and majors and lieutenants, those in charge were called controllers and officials or administrators, while the rank and file were forewomen and workers instead of sergeants and privates. The rank and file all bore army service numbers, and their specific work was to tackle all the day-to-day duties attached to army administration. And let's be clear that when these young women began signing up in March 1917, it was thought they'd only be needed in bases on the Western Front in France and Flanders, but they were soon to be found everywhere. So the next question to be asked is, what had prompted Irish women to come forward so eagerly? One clear driving force was because so many husbands, fathers, brothers, and friends had been already killed or wounded at the front. And the great wish was to try and help put an end to the terrible slaughter that the war was inflicting on families. But, of course, there were economic and political factors that worked too. The army pay for the women was good. And, this was a time when pay for women was not very good and very hard to get work. And it's also quite valid to suggest that for the Irish nationalists among their ranks, the promise of home rule for Ireland when the war was won had encouraged both men and women to sign up for army service. And of course, There may have been a number of other ulterior motives at play, especially as many WACs were also supporters of women's rights, both in politics and in the workplace. Now, I'll tell you, this was a concept that didn't always go down too well with the top brass military men, I can tell you. However, that said, one obvious area the army badly needed them for in 1917 was to replace the thousands of desk-bound, fully trained soldiers who had to remain stuck in administrative office work and other tasks behind the lines. Now, the best example I can use to outline the crucial priorities that spurred the first arrival of batches of women to work on the Western Front and on Western France is to tell you a little bit about the frantic call for help made by the Army's Royal Engineers just before Christmas 1916. The full story is told in my book, but it's a bit complicated, so I'm just going to give you a broad outline of what happened. Because I can tell you that it had been a time of real crisis for the Army's lines of communication. And those lines of communication, the whole campaign was totally reliant on them. You see, in those days, the development of radio and wireless technology was still only experimental. So the whole success of the Army's campaign rested almost entirely on wire-borne telephone and telegram messages. And these were vital to the smooth running of troop movements and battle plans. These systems were run by the Royal Engineers in what were called signal units. And this is interesting, whose members of these signal units, these members had not been normally recruited as serving soldiers because they were all, in fact, employees of the Post Office, or GPO, who'd come forward as volunteers because the Army chiefs had never got around to training their soldiers in these skills. Well, certainly for the Army, that had been a misguided decision. But by the end of 1916, an almost inevitable crisis was about to hit. Because by then the Army was fast running out of men capable of carrying out this work, as so many of these ex-GPO employees had been killed or wounded in dangerous positions up at the front line. So this meant that the only personnel left in signal units who could replace them were the skilled telegraph and telephone operators who worked in base exchanges and telegraph offices behind the lines, such as the one here shown in this photograph. Something had to be done fast, and there was only one solution. So a frantic call went out. Could the Army have some of the well-experienced GPO women, telegraph and telephone operators, to fill this gap in the Army base exchanges in France? Well, you could imagine what a shock that caused. But right enough, these ladies were entirely capable for the job, and the first of the women volunteers drawn from civilian post office exchanges were swiftly signed up as WACs. And by May 1917, they were being installed on the Western Front as signallers serving with the Royal Engineers. And I'm glad to be able to tell you that these early volunteers included a number of young women drawn from GPO exchanges all across Ireland, which included 3 who were originally from homes in County Armagh, who all served in France between 1917 and 1919. Now, before I go on, I'd like to draw your attention to something rather special in this photograph, because you'll notice that each girl is wearing her uniform coat dress, but if you look closely, you will also see they're displaying a small striped brassard or armband on their sleeves. And I can tell you that these were exactly the same as those worn by their male Army engineer colleagues in each signal unit. In other words, the armbands indicated that, having been seconded to the Royal Engineers, these young women were all looked upon as having an equal status as key workers with the same high responsibility as the men they worked side by side with. Now, I hardly need to tell you that to find this example of male and female colleagues being bestowed such an equal status by the Army was a pretty unique situation for those days. Security was extremely tight, and everyone engaged in the signal units were more or less kept really well segregated from other personnel in each base, because they carried the responsibility of hearing and see everything that was coming down the line from GHQ. And of course, although they were all bound to silence under the Official Secrets Act, it was too risky to let them mix with other units in a base when both on and off duty. So they had a tough, really tough conditions. And as one commentator later said of the girls' workload, the hours worked were staggering, even for wartime. And this was because their rosters had to cover 24 hours, which meant 3 shifts and a long night duty every day of the week, including Sundays. But the writer of this comment had been one of the younger army officers, and of course he'd been full of admiration for these ladies. And when he suggested that the girls should be mentioned in dispatches for their valour, the only response from the much older top brass in the Army's GHQ was rather less enthusiastic. He was merely sent a grumpy reminder that the generals never thanked rank and file soldiers for devotion to duty, and they were not going to treat these women any differently. Anyway, let me now move away from the ladies who served in France, because by far the greater majority of these WACs worked for the army in barracks and camps all across England, Scotland, Wales, and of course also here in Ireland. And I can give you some idea of their deployment here at home, because by 1918, at least 16 units had been established here, with still a few more due to come. So by the end of the war, there were a number of large units, all functioning in different locations in the cities of Dublin, Belfast, and Cork, as well as in several different places in the counties of Tipperary and Kildare. While other units, ranging from north to south, could be found in Donegal, Londonderry, Antrim, Armagh, Down, Louth, Carlow, and Kilkenny. Some WAC units were attached to well-known barracks. Others were installed in separate hutments as part of many largely extended camps. And I'll be saying a bit more about life in one of these army huts in a moment. But in the meantime, let me confirm that records show that the young Irish-born women who come forward to sign up had emerged from every social class and all religious denominations, and it's also clear that their birthplaces had included all 32 counties, north and south. So I expect you're probably wondering, what was the all-in-all total of Irish-born women who joined the WACs? And now, unfortunately, we can't ever know the exact figure, because there's altogether only about 7,000 army records now available. That's approximately only 12% of the full total, because this is all that survived a London bombing attack in the Second World War. And to make matters worse, there's the further difficulty that very few of these surviving records are for women who served in the higher ranks from 4 women upwards. And so details for most of the officials who are in charge as administrators are also missing. Well, of course, you could say you're extremely lucky to have managed to discover over 500 Irish-born names among the records that remained, and there's also evidence that can be garnered from other sources to be usefully drawn on. So I'm glad to say that I found 15 names for ladies who had roots in Armagh. 5 had been recruited to undertake office work. 3 were those ex-GPO girls working in telecommunication as signallers I've just been talking about. And 7 were taken on for a mixture of catering duties for army camps and cleaning works for barracks. Excuse me. On the broader scene, the army work undertaken by these WACs actually encompassed a much wider mixture of skills, which for the most part were very like these recruits' previous occupations in civilian life. These tasks were categorized by the army into 7 strictly defined sectors, A to G. So let's start with A, who were the many hundreds of backroom office workers and record keepers needed for every sector of army administration. Almost 1/4 of all the 500 known Irish members of the Corps worked in this capacity. And as I've said, there were 5 Armagh-born ladies engaged for this type of office work. And their home addresses had included Lurgan, Portadown, and Cosmogen, as well as Armagh and other locations near to the border with Uri in County Down. All but one had been taken on by the army as clerks in units, such as shown here in this photograph. The odd one out was a shorthand typist. She probably was attached to some officer as a secretary or something like that. And I should make it clear that only one of the clerks, like these ones here, actually served in France, as the rest were all posted to do office work in London. And in fact, two of these ladies had to withdraw quite early on for different reasons. Of course, when one looks at their family backgrounds, it's clear that the women working in Sector A were all drawn from middle-class homes, and their records indicate that their fathers' occupations were typically mainly some form of similar office-based position, sometimes attached to a profession, business, skilled trade, or maybe farming on a large scale. And by the way, before we leave this image, just a couple of comments to add. First is that the stylishly tailored uniform worn by the girl standing up on the left can clearly identify her as one of those higher ranking women called administrators. Her rank would have possibly equaled that of an army lieutenant or captain. And the other point to make is that this depiction of record keeping for merely one of the Western Front's many motor transport sections can demonstrate something of the sheer scale of the physical hands-on paperwork that the war had created. So next, categorised as B were the equally important army cooks and other supported catering staff for barracks, bases and camps, who together with other domestic workers were engaged as cleaners and laundry women. And this B sector made up by far the greatest number of the WAC known to be drawn from Ireland. Well, probably won't be any surprise to you when I say that more than half the 500 Irish recruits we know about were put to work in this sector. All but one of the Armagh ladies working in this category were posted to barracks and camps here in Ireland. One was a cook, the others catering or domestic workers, but one of them had been sent to serve in England as a waitress for an officers' mess near London. Now, it should be pointed out that the rules and work they did in Irish units were exactly the same as those who were dispatched elsewhere. For example, here's a group of these workers who were waiting for that day's orders under the supervision of their forewomen. The scene here is set somewhere in France, which can be identified by the Nissen mounts in the background. Clearly definable as category B domestics, most of the group are wearing white overalls over their standard uniform coat dresses. But you can spot a couple of their higher ranking forewomen who didn't have to wear overalls because their job was only to supervise and allocate the various tasks that had to be done. The next section, called C, were drivers of army vehicles, and these young women were confined to serving in France or Flanders. This rule included WAC motorbike dispatch riders and motor mechanics. I'm afraid nobody from Armagh qualified for this category, but it's not too surprising to learn that the few known names of those who came forward from Ireland were all drawn from motor car only upper class families. And of course, I have to say that the same can be said for the ladies from England and Scotland. So they were the people who had motor cars, and obviously the girls had learned to drive them. By early 1918, a separate branch of the Corps, known as the WAF, WAAF, Women's Auxiliary Air Force, had been created. And this sector included members who were capable of working as aeroplane mechanics. And there were a couple of Irish women among them, but I think they weren't allowed to do any flying. Not in those days. They did in the Second World War, but not in the First World War. The next section, called G, is classified as for miscellaneous and unskilled jobs, including that of storewomen or storekeepers. And there were certainly a number of young Irish women recruited for this sector. And it makes sense that most of them had already some previous experience as civilians in shopkeeping or factory work, which obviously made them well used to handling many types of finished goods, including the issue of a uniform to a new recruit, as shown in this photograph. Section E were those GPO ladies I've just been talking to you about, who were brought in to be attached to the Royal Engineers, signal units. Their work on the Army's line of communication was, of course, strictly confined to posts in France or Flanders. Before being accepted for this work, they'd all been carefully vetted by their postmasters as suitable candidates. And a knowledge of French was one of the attributes needed, because their assignments weren't only confined to the 7 army bases on the Western Front, but they also had to run some of the small exchanges in outlying French towns and villages, whose former civilian telephone and telegraph system had been taken over by the army. Now, here again, in this photograph, you'll notice that they're all wearing those distinctive signalers armbands. They were actually in the colours of blue and white. And it goes without saying that the pressure on signal telegraphists was as equally onerous as that of the work of the telephonist. The sending and receiving of telegram messages each day across the whole of the Western Front could add up to as many as 45,000 a day, which is a staggering figure, 45,000 a day. They often had to work with complicated codes for security reasons. And also, in the same way as the telephonists were kept well segregated from everyone else in the base, they didn't mix with other sectors. And they worked rosters for 7 days a week for months on end. And to add to that, the working conditions for all the signal women were not without very real perils, because they had to remain at their posts on switchboards and in telegraph exchanges throughout air raid bombing attacks. And for this reason, the WACs in France were always issued with tin hats. And regular training sessions were held because of the increasing number of air raids on these bases. There are several instances of signal women remaining on duty in highly dangerous situations, and some of them were later deemed as noteworthy, such as the time when the Army's frontline HQ in St. Omer was so close to a raging battle that all personnel at the base had been ordered to withdraw to the safety of another town many miles away. That's all the generals and all the HQ and everyone else, except, would you believe, the signal women, who had to operate the crucial lines of communication. They had to stay on duty, and their continued presence was to save the day on that occasion. And it was afterwards said that only for the remaining on duty as the battle raged dangerously close, this was 1918, remember, the successful outcome of the war might have been a very, very different story indeed. So, were there any Irish women on duty in that particular base that day? Can't say for sure, but there was certainly one of the Armagh ladies who served as a signaller here in this base in 1918. So it's very, very possible that she might have been on duty on that particular occasion, which is something quite fascinating. Of course, the lifestyle for many wasn't always so pressurized. The work categories F and G were relatively late additional categories, which included WACs who acted as grooms for any of the higher ranking administrators who wanted to spend off-duty hours on horseback. And while there's plenty of evidence of clear class divisions within this ranking system, I would like to add that the top-ranking women, who are often professionals, such as doctors or academics, are very strong in encouraging bright lower grade workers and forewomen to apply for an upgrade of their original starters, which would be, I suppose, the equivalent of gaining an army commission. Now, they had to undergo extra training and a written exam was needed, but it meant extra pay and a tailored uniform. And I dare say a lot more work with no extra pay, though the pay would have gone up too. In fact, these two sectors covered an increasing diversity of new jobs, and strange ones too, which included tending war graves from France right up to 1921, while other extra tasks for new recruits had ranged from work as army tailors, printers, and camouflage painting to factory workers, machine turners. You could say that by then, there was literally nothing very much that these reliable core women could not be asked to tackle, which is well proven by another small, very elite, but very active group who actually only became publicly known about until much later on when the war was over, because these girls were called and known as the Hushwacks. They were top secret crypto-analysis, in other words, code breakers, who were the forerunners of Bletchley Park in the Second World War. These ladies worked in France, and I'm glad to tell you that this secret group had at least one known Irish woman in their ranks who's been identified by Caroline Carr, who's attached to Donegal's County Museum Local History Studies. The young Hushwac's name was Catherine Osborne, she was the daughter of a doctor in Milford. However, let me add very quickly that none of these portraits are of her, and as far as I know, all these faces of former Hushwacks have been deliberately remained anonymous. So now let me give you a little bit more information about how things were organised here in Ireland. The very earliest recruits who applied in 1917 had usually travelled individually to London to sign up. But by the end of that year, efforts had begun to set up a separate Dublin headquarters for all of Ireland. And a special recruiting unit was soon created, which then liaised with all the local labour exchanges. Anyone wanting to join up was asked to first fill up a form in their local exchange. And if the applicant was deemed suitable, then 3 references were then sought. These details were then subsequently processed by the Waxbone Recruitment Unit, who sometimes travelled to various key locations in Munster, such as Waterford or Limerick, to finalise the form filling. Once accepted and deemed medically fit, all the women were then sent to the Belfast depot for a couple or so weeks training. And that's what all Belfast was really used for. They were sent there for their training before being assigned to a unit attached to a barracks or camps in another location. And these locations could be in France, or they could be in England, or they could be here in Ireland. The Army service records reveal that Wax from Ireland served in a wide diversity of places, and they were regularly moved back and forth from barracks and camps as needs for staff either increased or diminished. Records also reveal that for the most part, these postings were to locations many miles away from their home place, which seems to be being a deliberate policy. And when a batch of women were sent to a camp, they'd usually be allocated living accommodation in a standard army hut, such as the one in Moore Park, Fermoy, shown here. But you may be sure that these hutments were all set very well away from wherever the camp's male soldiers were billeted. Each hut provided the women with dormitory-style sleeping quarters, and the off-duty hours were spent relaxing at the far end of each hut, where they could gather round a large metal stove to keep warm. Each camp would provide separate washrooms, and the women took all their meals in a designated mess hall. Now, I'm sure you're all aware that you are particularly fortunate in having a reconstruction of this type of army hut that you can visit in the Down County Museum, where a reproduction of a hut from the Ballykinler camp is on display. Here's what it looked like when I made a visit to see it recently. This style of army hut in Ballykinler was in use for regular soldiers for several decades, including both World Wars. And you'd be interested to learn that one of your Lurgan-born girls, an assistant cook, would have lived in a hut like this when she was posted to Ballykinler to fill in for a missing colleague for 4 weeks in the autumn of 1919. By that time, the camp was being used for convalescent wounded men and as an officers' training camp. And the WAC unit that served here between 1918 and 1919 were mainly employed as catering staff for the officers' mess. Although there were at least 2 of them here that were WACs who were working as office clerks with responsibility for the unit's administration. The life story of one of the WACs, who was actually originally a Dublin girl, but who had been living and working in Belfast for some years, when she enlisted in May 1918, is featured here as an example of the 27 named WACs whom we know for certain served in Ballykinler camp up to November 1919. So it's well worth a visit. So we must press on because there's a couple more things that I should add for clarification. In the spring of 1918, it was decided to change the title of the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps to that of Queen Mary's Army Auxiliary Corps. However, as I've explained, the original acronym WACS, WAACS, for members still remained just as well used until the formal dispersal of the Corps took place in London in September 1921. For anyone wanting to know more, such records that have survived with the Corps are all now digitized. They can be easily accessed online in the National Archives in Kew in London, and these and all the other sources I've used can, of course, as I've said, be found in my published study issued by Pen and Sword back in April 2020. Stories featuring women from many different parts of Ireland are plentiful, and these accounts can fill in much more of the details that lie behind the viewpoints that I've been able to share with you this evening. And the tales I tell just don't end with the armistice in November 1918, of course, because quite a few ups and downs lay ahead for all these young women in the post-war era. For example, one Armagh-born lady who later emigrated to Australia, is featured in my book as a fascinating case history, because fate chose to see this couple's close link to home in Ireland temporarily re-established during a visit back here in the Second World War, and they got stuck here for the Second World War. And I have other case histories to provide insight into those post-war times. Now, one has to be honest. I don't want to give the impression that the whole experience of army life for every one of these women was always that of great satisfaction. Of course, there was plenty of convivial companionship. A lot of very good and lasting friendships were made, but there had been also many times when pockets of unrest and unease had arisen, even anger and threatened revolt. The fighting at the front may have ceased with the armistice, but gaining a discharge as a WAC was a slow process, and often even long delayed, because of the huge volume of office paperwork still needed for the post-war movement of men and military equipment back to the UK. One mustn't forget, of course, that these women weren't afraid of standing up for their rights, but the rigorous discipline they'd endured during wartime may have become a bit tedious. Certainly by the end of 1919 and into 1920, tempers were becoming frayed over delays to back pay due for those who had already been granted a dispersal. And the truth is that for many facing with a return to civilian life, those times were fraught with difficulties. Work was hard to find. The deadly Spanish flu was still raging, and the new normal that they were facing into had utterly changed their expectations. It was probably a sign of the times, that so many ex-army veterans, both men and women alike, later chose to live abroad in preference to remaining at home. And Armagh was no different in this respect. Records show there was one local lady who requested a discharge in 1919 in order to marry a French citizen. And there were several others who were opting for offers of free travel to Canada for servicemen and women who would be willing to undertake farm work for that country's expanding western wheat fields. And again, in the meantime, the Australian authorities were also calling for ex-army people to reclaim bushlands for fruit farming. And the temptation to seek fame and fortune in the United States offered even more exciting opportunities. For the former WACs, the experience and responsibility of their wartime days had built a great deal of confidence. And the onset of a new and exciting decade, which was already being dubbed the Roaring Twenties, had arrived with a challenge. And, one's left wondering how many more untold stories might be found if we go digging a bit deeper into the background of the local names and army records that we know about. I'd say here's a challenge we shouldn't ignore, because there's clearly plenty of work that could still be done by members of local or family history societies that might throw more light on the women who served from 1917 onwards and what happened to them afterwards. For my own part, my work only followed up on the three telegraphists who were born in Armagh. And as I've just explained, I used one of them as an interesting extended case history. But I'm very happy to share a few more leads and details to anyone who wishes to pursue the post-war experiences of the other two former wax singers, and may also suggest that the remaining 12 names and details that I have set out in a chart for the use of County Armagh's local studies may prove to be the base for some interesting local research for you to follow up on for your own separate study. Army records contain health reports, civilian work references, and often letters from recruits. There may be half-remembered family anecdotes, or perhaps there's old photographs, letters, postcards, or other memorabilia that hold clues. And I should remind you that anyone who has served in France received the same medals as male soldiers. There's also online records for births, deaths, and marriages. There's passenger lists for those who travelled off to Canada or elsewhere. And I'm sure there must be local families in Armagh that may be still linked to these former servicewomen by blood ties or old friendships. So, if the shadows that have hung over these ladies for the last 100 years can be thus swept away by their descendants today, maybe these enterprising women will no longer sadly qualify as a piece of our forgotten history. I think you'll agree it would be a truly wonderful thing to happen. Thank you.